The winter storm swept across the Montana Territory with a fury that Catherine Monroe had never witnessed in all her 22 years, transforming the landscape into a white hell that swallowed everything in its path. She had been traveling from Helena to Fort Benton in January of 1883 to meet her uncle, a merchant who had promised her work in his trading post, but the stagecoach driver had misjudged the weather, and now she found herself clinging to consciousness in a world of howling wind and blinding snow. The coach had overturned 2 miles back, the horses had bolted in terror, and the driver lay dead beneath the wreckage with his neck broken, leaving Catherine alone to stumble through drifts that reached her waist, her elegant traveling dress offering no protection against the savage cold that gnawed at her bones. She had almost given up, had almost let herself sink into the snow and surrender to the seductive promise of sleep, when a strong hand gripped her arm and a deep voice cut through the wind. "Miss, you keep walking like this. You will be dead within the hour." Catherine looked up through ice-crusted eyelashes to see a man bundled in a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes a startling shade of blue that seemed to pierce right through her. "I am Jake Hartley," he said, already pulling her along with surprising gentleness. "My horse broke his leg in a snowdrift half a mile back, so I'm on foot same as you, but I know these lands, and there is an old trapper's cabin about a mile northeast, if we can reach it." Catherine wanted to argue, wanted to ask why she should trust a stranger in the middle of nowhere, but her teeth were chattering too violently for speech, and her fingers had gone numb inside her thin gloves. Jake was already moving, one arm wrapped around her waist to support her weight, and she had no choice but to follow. He was tall, perhaps 26 or 27, with broad shoulders and a lean strength that suggested years of hard living on the frontier. His jaw was dark with stubble, and his face bore a long scar along one cheekbone that gave him a dangerous appearance, but his grip was careful, almost protective, and Catherine found herself leaning into his warmth as they fought their way through the storm. "What were you doing out here alone?" She managed to gasp between steps, needing the distraction of conversation to keep her mind from the cold. "Bounty hunting," Jake replied without hesitation. "Was tracking a horse thief through these mountains when the storm hit. Lost his trail and my mount both. What about you?" "Stagecoach," Catherine said. "Overturned. The driver is dead." Jake's expression darkened, but he did not slow their pace. "Nothing we can do for him now. Focus on staying alive, miss. What is your name?" "Catherine. Catherine Monroe." "Well, Catherine Monroe, you picked a hell of a time to travel through Montana Territory. January is the worst month for blizzards up here." "I did not have much choice," Catherine said, a flash of defiance warming her despite the cold. "My father died 6 months ago, and my stepmother made it clear I was no longer welcome in San Francisco. My uncle offered me work, and I took it." Jake glanced at her, and something in his expression softened. "Rough situation, but at least your uncle cared enough to offer. That counts for something." They walked in silence after that, saving their breath for the brutal journey. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow fell so thickly that Catherine could barely see 3 feet ahead. Her legs burned with exhaustion, and her lungs ached from breathing the freezing air, but Jake kept pulling her forward with relentless determination. She lost track of time, lost track of everything except the rhythm of placing one foot in front of the other, and then suddenly Jake was pushing open a door and dragging her into darkness. The cabin was small, perhaps 12 feet square, with a single room that smelled of dust and old wood smoke. Catherine collapsed onto the dirt floor, gasping while Jake moved quickly to secure the door against the wind. The temperature inside was barely warmer than outside, but the absence of wind felt like a blessing. Catherine could hear Jake moving around in the darkness, and then there was the scratch of a match, and golden light bloomed as he lit an oil lamp that someone had left on a crude wooden table. The cabin was sparse, furnished only with the table, a single chair, and a narrow bunk against one wall. There was a small iron stove in the corner, and Jake immediately began examining it. "Stovepipe is intact," he muttered, "and there is wood stacked here. Whoever used this place last left it well supplied. That is good luck for us." Catherine tried to stand, but her legs would not support her weight. She sat on the floor, shaking violently, watching as Jake expertly arranged kindling in the stove and lit it with another match. The flames caught quickly, and he added larger pieces of wood, coaxing the fire to life. Only when it was burning steadily did he turn his attention back to Catherine, and his expression turned grim. "Take off your gloves," he ordered. Catherine fumbled with the buttons, but her fingers were too numb and clumsy. Jake knelt beside her and gently pulled the gloves off himself, and then he swore under his breath. Catherine looked down and saw that her fingers were white and waxy, completely devoid of color. "Frostbite," Jake said flatly. "Not severe yet, but it will be if we do not warm you up properly. Your dress is soaked through. You need to get out of those wet clothes immediately." Catherine stared at him, her mind slow to process his words. "I cannot," she said automatically. "You can and you will," Jake said, his voice hard. "Listen to me, Catherine. Your core temperature has dropped dangerously low. Those wet clothes are pulling heat from your body faster than the fire can replace it. If you stay in them, you will die from hypothermia within a few hours. I have seen it happen before on the trail, and it is not a pleasant death." "But I cannot just undress in front of you," Catherine protested weakly. Jake met her eyes, and his expression was utterly serious. "We strip or die from hypothermia tonight," he said bluntly. "That is the choice. I'm not trying to compromise your virtue, Miss Monroe. I'm trying to save your life. My clothes are damp too, and I'm at risk, same as you. We need to get out of these wet things, wrap ourselves in whatever dry material we can find, and share body heat by the fire. It is the only way we survive until this storm passes." Catherine looked into his blue eyes and saw no deception there, only grim determination and an honest concern that touched something deep inside her. She was a proper young woman from San Francisco, raised to believe that modesty was paramount, but she was also practical enough to recognize truth when she heard it. The cold was already seeping into her bones, and she could feel herself growing dangerously sleepy. If she refused Jake's advice out of misplaced propriety, she would die in this cabin, and her uncle would never know what had happened to her. "All right," she whispered, "I trust you." Relief flickered across Jake's face. He stood and moved to the bunk, pulling off the thin mattress to reveal a storage space beneath. "There should be blankets," he muttered, rummaging through the space. He pulled out 2 wool blankets, musty but dry, and several animal pelts that smelled of old fur. "These will do. Turn around, Catherine. I will get out of my wet things first, and you can have privacy to change." He turned his back to her and began shrugging out of his heavy coat. Catherine watched for a moment, then forced herself to look away and focus on her own clothing. Her fingers were still too numb to manage the buttons down the back of her dress, and after a minute of fumbling, she had to swallow her pride. "Jake, I need help. I cannot reach the buttons." He turned, already stripped down to his undershirt and trousers, both damp with melted snow. His body was lean and muscular, the body of a man who made his living through physical labor, and Catherine felt her cheeks flush despite the cold. Jake approached without comment and carefully unfastened the long row of buttons down her back, his fingers surprisingly deft. "There," he said quietly. "I will turn around again. Call me when you are wrapped in the blankets." Catherine struggled out of her dress, her corset, her layers of petticoats, all of them heavy with moisture. She stripped down to her chemise and drawers, both damp but not soaked through, and then she wrapped herself in one of the wool blankets, pulling it tight around her shoulders. "I am covered," she said. Jake turned back, now wearing only his drawers and wrapped in the second blanket. He picked up their wet clothes and draped them over the chair near the stove, arranging them to catch the heat. Then he added more wood to the fire and adjusted the vents until the flames were burning hot and steady. The temperature in the cabin was already beginning to rise, but Catherine was still shaking violently, and Jake noticed. "You are still too cold," he said. "We need to share body heat, Catherine. I am going to sit next to you by the stove, and we need to huddle together under the blankets and pelts. It is not improper when it is a matter of survival." Catherine nodded, beyond caring about propriety now. Jake sat down beside her on the floor, his back against the wall near the stove, and he pulled her against his side. He wrapped both blankets around them, then draped the animal pelts over the top, creating a cocoon of warmth. Catherine could feel the heat of his body immediately, a blessed warmth that made her realize just how dangerously cold she had been. She pressed closer instinctively, and Jake's arm came around her shoulders, holding her securely. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the stove. Gradually, feeling began to return to Catherine's fingers and toes, bringing with it a painful tingling that made her gasp. "That is good," Jake said quietly. "Pain means the blood is flowing again. Flex your fingers and toes to keep the circulation going." Catherine did as he instructed, gritting her teeth against the discomfort. As the immediate danger of freezing receded, she became acutely aware of their situation. She was huddled half-naked with a strange man in a remote cabin, their bodies pressed together in a way that would have scandalized every matron in San Francisco. Yet she felt no fear, no sense of impropriety. Jake had been nothing but respectful, and his sole focus had been on their survival. She found herself studying his profile in the lamplight, noting the strong line of his jaw, the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the way his eyes reflected the firelight. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving my life, for being decent about it." Jake glanced down at her, and a slight smile touched his lips. "You do not need to thank me, Catherine. Any man with a shred of honor would do the same." "I think you would be surprised at how few men have honor," Catherine said with unexpected bitterness. "My stepmother's brother certainly proved that when he tried to force himself on me after my father died. That was the real reason I left San Francisco so quickly." Jake's arm tightened around her shoulders, and his expression darkened. "Did he hurt you?" "No. I hit him with a fireplace poker and ran, but my stepmother blamed me, said I had enticed him. She told me to leave her house within the week." Catherine felt tears sting her eyes at the memory. "I thought my life was over, but then my uncle's letter arrived, and I realized I had a chance to start fresh." "Your uncle sounds like a good man," Jake said, "and you are stronger than you know." "Catherine, not many city women would have survived the walk to this cabin. You kept moving even when you wanted to give up. That takes courage." Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, and it had nothing to do with the fire or the blankets. "What about you?" she asked. "How did you end up bounty hunting in Montana territory?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "I grew up in Texas," he said finally. "My father was a rancher, and I thought I would spend my life working cattle. But the ranch failed during a drought in '76, and my parents died of fever the following winter. I was 19, alone, and I drifted north looking for work. I tried ranching, mining, even worked as a railroad guard for a while, but I was good with a gun and better at tracking than most, so I fell into bounty hunting about 4 years ago. It is dangerous work, but it pays well, and I answer to no one but myself." "Do you like it?" Catherine asked. "Sometimes," Jake admitted. "I like the freedom, the challenge of the hunt, but it is a lonely life. Always moving from place to place, never putting down roots. Sometimes I wonder if I should try to save enough money to buy my own land, start a ranch like my father had. But then I think about all the work and risk, and I tell myself maybe next year." "I understand that feeling," Catherine said. "When my father was alive, I had a comfortable life, but I always felt like I was waiting for something, like there was supposed to be more than just attending parties and waiting for some suitable man to propose marriage. Now I have nothing, but somehow I feel more alive than I ever did in San Francisco. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Jake said, and when he smiled at her, Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. They talked through the night as the storm raged outside, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their disappointments. Catherine learned that Jake loved poetry, that he carried a battered copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass in his saddlebag, and that he could recite entire passages from memory. Jake learned that Catherine played piano beautifully, that she had a sharp head for numbers that her father had encouraged, and that she dreamed of one day running her own business. As the hours passed, Catherine found herself drawn to this quiet, thoughtful man who had saved her life without asking for anything in return. Sometime near dawn, exhaustion finally claimed them both. Catherine drifted off to sleep with her head on Jake's shoulder, and she woke several hours later to find pale sunlight streaming through the gaps in the cabin walls. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine white snow. Jake was already awake, carefully adding wood to the stove and checking their clothes. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her stirring. "How do you feel?" Catherine flexed her fingers and toes experimentally. Everything was sore, but the dangerous numbness was gone. "Better," she said. "Alive, thanks to you." "Your dress is almost dry," Jake said. "Another hour by the fire and you should be able to get dressed. I will go outside and assess our situation, see if I can figure out the best route to Fort Benton." He pulled on his own clothes, which were still slightly damp but serviceable, and stepped outside. Catherine sat by the fire, wrapped in her blanket, and tried to sort through the confusion of emotions swirling in her chest. She had known Jake Hartley for less than 24 hours, but she felt closer to him than she had ever felt to anyone in her life. He had seen her vulnerable, had saved her without judgment, and had treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. She found herself hoping that their paths would not diverge once they reached Fort Benton, and the intensity of that hope surprised her. Jake returned after about 15 minutes, his expression thoughtful. "The snow is deep, but the sun is out and the wind has died down. We can make it to Fort Benton if we leave within the hour and keep a steady pace. It will take most of the day, but we should arrive before dark." Catherine nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. Once they reached Fort Benton, Jake would continue on to wherever his bounty hunting took him, and she would begin her new life working for her uncle. They would probably never see each other again. The thought was almost unbearable. She dressed behind the blanket that Jake held up for her privacy, and then they prepared to leave the cabin. Jake gathered some of the dried meat and hardtack that had been stored beneath the bunk, dividing it between them for the journey. He also took one of the wool blankets, folding it and slinging it across his shoulders like a cape. Then they set out into the glittering white landscape. The journey was long and exhausting, but nothing compared to the nightmare of the previous day. The sun warmed them as they walked, and Jake proved to be an excellent guide, finding the easiest paths through the snowdrifts. They talked as they walked, continuing the conversation they had started the night before, and Catherine found herself memorizing every detail about him. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the sound of his laugh, the careful way he helped her over obstacles. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge and saw Fort Benton spread out below them, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along the banks of the Missouri River. Relief flooded through Catherine, followed immediately by a sharp pang of loss. "We made it," she said softly. "We did," Jake agreed, but his tone was subdued. They descended into town together, and Jake led her straight to the trading post that bore her uncle's name, Monroe Mercantile. A portly man with graying hair and kind eyes looked up from behind the counter as they entered, and his face went pale. "Catherine," he gasped. "Good Lord, child, we heard the stagecoach never arrived. We thought you were dead." "I nearly was," Catherine said, and she quickly explained what had happened. Her uncle, Thomas Monroe, listened with growing horror, and then he turned to Jake with tears in his eyes. "You saved my niece's life," he said hoarsely. "I do not know how to thank you properly, Mr. Hartley." "No thanks necessary," Jake said. "I'm just glad we both survived." Thomas insisted on giving Jake a room at the boarding house he owned, along with a hot meal and new supplies. Jake accepted with quiet grace, and Catherine felt her heart twist as she realized this was goodbye. Thomas led her upstairs to a comfortable apartment above the Mercantile, chattering about all his plans for her, but Catherine could barely focus on his words. Her mind was full of Jake, and when her uncle finally left her alone to rest, she sank onto the bed and let the tears come. She had been saved from death only to lose something precious before she even fully understood what it was. The unfairness of it made her want to scream. 3 days passed. Catherine threw herself into learning the mercantile business, and Thomas proved to be a patient and enthusiastic teacher. He was delighted to have family in Fort Benton, and he made it clear that he intended to leave the business to her when he retired. It should have been everything Catherine wanted, but she found herself distracted, constantly watching the door and hoping to see a tall figure with blue eyes and a scarred face. On the 4th day, Jake appeared in the mercantile just as Catherine was closing up for the evening. Her heart leaped at the sight of him, and she had to grip the counter to steady herself. "Jake," she breathed. "Catherine," he said, and he looked uncomfortable, almost nervous. "I hope I am not intruding. I have been staying in town, picking up supplies for the trail, and I kept thinking I should come see you, but I did not want to complicate your new life." "You could never complicate anything," Catherine said quickly. "I am glad you came. I have been thinking about you constantly." Jake's expression softened. "I have been thinking about you too," he admitted. "In fact, I have not been able to think about much else. Catherine, I know we only spent 1 night together, and I know you probably think I'm crazy, but that night changed something in me. I have never felt this way about anyone before." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying, Jake?" "I am saying that I do not want to leave Fort Benton if it means leaving you," Jake said. "I know it is fast, and I know I have nothing to offer you except a horse I still need to buy and whatever bounties I can collect. But Catherine, I think I am falling in love with you. I think I started falling the moment I saw you struggling through that snow, refusing to give up." Joy flooded through Catherine, so intense it made her dizzy. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I thought I was losing my mind, feeling this way after such a short time, but Jake, you saved my life. You held me through the worst night of my life and made me feel safe. You talked to me like I mattered, like my thoughts and dreams were important. How could I not fall in love with you?" Jake crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. His kiss was fierce and tender at once, full of the passion and desperation they had both been feeling. Catherine melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and for the first time in days, she felt complete. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly, ask your uncle's permission, build something real with you. But Catherine, I need you to know that my life is dangerous. Bounty hunting makes enemies, and I could not live with myself if something happened to you because of me." "Then stop bounty hunting," Catherine said simply. "Jake, you told me yourself that you dreamed of buying land and starting a ranch. Why not do it here? My uncle has connections throughout the territory. He could help you find property, and I could help you run it. We could build a life together." Jake stared at her as if she had offered him the moon. "You would do that?" he asked, "and you would take that risk on me?" "I already have," Catherine said, smiling through her tears. "I trusted you with my life in that cabin, Jake Hartley. Trusting you with my heart is easy by comparison." Jake kissed her again. And this time there was no desperation, only certainty and hope. They went to Thomas Monroe that evening and laid everything out before him. Thomas listened carefully, asked Jake pointed questions about his intentions and his means, and then he surprised them both by grinning broadly. "I have been hoping Catherine would find someone worthy of her," he said, "and any man who saved her life in a blizzard and was honorable enough to keep her safe without taking advantage has my respect. But Jake, you need to understand that my niece is precious to me. If you hurt her, I will hunt you down myself." "I would expect nothing less, sir," Jake said seriously. "I give you my word that I will spend the rest of my life making Catherine happy." "Then you have my blessing," Thomas said. "In fact, I have a proposition for you both. I own several thousand acres of grazing land about 10 miles north of town. I bought it years ago as an investment, but I've never had the time or inclination to develop it. If you two are serious about starting a ranch, I will deed you 500 acres as a wedding present, and I will loan you the capital to buy your first herd at a fair interest rate. Catherine can continue to help me with the mercantile until the ranch is established, and then you can decide together what makes the most sense for your family." Catherine threw her arms around her uncle, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you so much." Jake looked overwhelmed, and Catherine could see him struggling with his pride, with the instinct to refuse charity. But then he met her eyes, and whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. "I accept your generous offer, sir," he said to Thomas, "and I promise you will not regret it. I will make that land prosper, and I will take care of your niece as if she were made of gold." "She is made of something far stronger than gold," Thomas said warmly. "She is made of Monroe's stubbornness and spirit. You're going to have your hands full, Jake Hartley." Jake smiled at Catherine, and the love in his eyes made her heart soar. "I am counting on it," he said. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Fort Benton. Catherine wore a dress of blue silk that her uncle had ordered specially from St. Louis, and Jake wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. The entire town turned out for the wedding, curious to see the couple whose survival story had already become local legend. As Catherine spoke her vows, promising to love and cherish Jake until death parted them, she thought back to that terrifying night in the blizzard and marveled at how far they had come. They spent their wedding night in a room at the Grand Union Hotel, the finest establishment in Fort Benton. Jake was tender and patient, taking his time to ensure Catherine's comfort, and when they finally came together as husband and wife, Catherine felt as if her soul had found its home. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, talking and laughing and making plans for their future. "I never thought I would be this happy," Catherine whispered. "6 weeks ago, I thought my life was ending. Now I feel like it is just beginning." "We survived together," Jake said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That night in the cabin, we learned to trust each other completely. That is a foundation that most couples take years to build, and we did it in a single night. Everything else will be easy by comparison." Catherine smiled. "I would not say easy," she teased. "Building a ranch from scratch is going to be hard work." "Then it is a good thing we are both stubborn," Jake said, grinning. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Jake spent his days at the ranch site, clearing land, and beginning construction on their cabin with the help of several hired men. Catherine divided her time between the mercantile and the ranch, helping Jake with planning while also learning every aspect of her uncle's business. It was exhausting work, but Catherine had never been happier. She loved watching their cabin take shape, loved seeing Jake's pride as he showed her each new addition. She loved the way he held her at night, the way he listened when she talked about her ideas for the ranch, the way he made her laugh even when they were both bone-tired. By early summer, the cabin was finished, a sturdy 2-room structure with a large fireplace and windows that looked out over the rolling grassland. Jake had also built a small barn and several corrals, and Thomas had made good on his promise to help them purchase their first herd. They started with 50 head of cattle and 2 good horses, and Jake threw himself into the work of ranching with the same determination he had once applied to bounty hunting. Catherine proved to be a natural rancher. She kept meticulous records of their expenses and income, and she had a gift for predicting market trends that impressed even her uncle. Within a year, they had doubled their herd and were turning a modest profit. Within 2 years, they were one of the most successful small ranches in the territory. In the spring of 1885, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. She told Jake one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset over their land, and she would never forget the look of wonder that crossed his face. "A baby," he breathed. "Catherine, are you certain?" "The doctor confirmed it yesterday," Catherine said, laughing at his expression. "You're going to be a father, Jake Hartley." Jake pulled her into his arms and held her as if she were made of glass. "I am going to be the best father I can be," he vowed. This child will never doubt for a moment that he or she is loved. Their son was born in late October, a healthy baby with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determination. They named him Thomas, after Catherine's uncle, and the old man wept with joy when they told him. Little Thomas was an easy baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss, and both Jake and Catherine fell completely in love with him. Watching Jake with their son made Catherine fall in love with her husband all over again. He was a gentle, patient father, always ready to walk the floor with Thomas when he was fussy, always happy to change diapers or give baths. He sang to their son in a surprisingly good baritone, old trail songs and lullabies he remembered from his own childhood, and Catherine would often find them both asleep in the rocking chair by the fire, Thomas curled against his father's chest. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. The ranch continued to prosper, and they added more land and more cattle. Thomas grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who followed his father everywhere and peppered him with endless questions. In 1888, Catherine gave birth to twin girls, Anna and Margaret, who had their mother's dark hair and their father's mischievous grin. The cabin had to be expanded to accommodate their growing family, and Jake built a beautiful addition with 3 bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Catherine's Uncle Thomas remained a constant presence in their lives, visiting the ranch at least once a week and spoiling his great nieces and nephews shamelessly. He eventually retired from the mercantile and deeded the business to a young couple from back east, but he stayed actively involved in the community and took great pride in telling everyone about his niece's success. In the spring of 1890, Jake received a letter from an old bounty hunting acquaintance inviting him to join a pursuit of a notorious gang that was terrorizing ranches in Wyoming territory. The pay was substantial, and for a moment Catherine saw the old restlessness flash in her husband's eyes. But then Jake crumpled the letter and tossed it into the fire. "Those days are behind me," he said firmly. "I have everything I need right here." Catherine crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving up that life?" Jake turned to face her, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Not for a single second," he said. "Catherine, you and our children are the best things that ever happened to me. That night in the blizzard, when I found you struggling through the snow, I thought I was just saving a stranger's life. I had no idea I was meeting my future, my purpose, my everything. I would not trade this life for all the bounties in the world." Tears filled Catherine's eyes. "I love you so much," she whispered. "I love you too," Jake said, and he kissed her with all the passion and tenderness of their wedding night. As the years continued to pass, the Hartley Ranch became one of the most respected operations in Montana. Their children grew strong and capable, learning the ranching business from the ground up. Thomas proved to have his father's gift for handling horses, and by the time he was 15, he was breaking and training colts that other ranchers paid good money to purchase. Anna inherited her mother's head for numbers and took over the ranch's bookkeeping when she was just 13, catching an error that saved them hundreds of dollars. Margaret turned out to be a gifted negotiator, able to charm the toughest cattle buyers into paying top dollar for their stock. In 1896, Catherine's Uncle Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 71. The entire town mourned him, and Catherine grieved deeply for the man who had given her a second chance when she needed it most. In his will, Thomas left his entire estate to Catherine and Jake, including his house in town and a substantial amount of savings. They used the money to build a proper ranch house to replace the cabin, a beautiful 2-story structure with indoor plumbing and electric lights powered by a generator. One evening in the fall of 1897, 14 years after that fateful blizzard, Catherine and Jake sat together on the porch of their new house, watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was 22 now, tall and strong and engaged to a sweet girl from town. Anna and Margaret were 16, beautiful and confident young women who had their parents wrapped around their fingers. Life was good, better than Catherine had ever dreamed possible. "Do you remember that night in the cabin?" Jake asked suddenly, his hand finding Catherine's and lacing their fingers together. "Every detail," Catherine said softly. I remember being so cold I thought I would die. I remember being terrified when you said we had to strip, and I remember looking into your eyes and deciding to trust you. Best decision you ever made, Jake teased, and Catherine laughed. It really was, she said seriously. Jake, that night we did not just survive together. We learned to depend on each other completely, to trust without reservation. That trust has been the foundation of everything we built. Our marriage, our family, this ranch, all of it started with that decision to trust each other in our darkest moment. Jake raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. I knew I loved you before the sun rose that next morning, he confessed. I spent that whole night holding you, listening to you talk, and I kept thinking that I'd never met anyone like you. You were brave and smart and kind, and even half frozen. You had more spirit than most people I had ever known. When we got to Fort Benton and your uncle took you upstairs, I felt like someone had carved out my heart. I knew I had to come back for you, had to at least try to see if you felt the same way. I felt the same way, Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. I cried for hours after you left, thinking I would never see you again. And when you walked into the mercantile 3 days later, I thought my heart would burst with happiness. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Their children's laughter drifted across the yard, and somewhere in the distance cattle lowed as the hands drove them toward the barn for the evening. It was a peaceful, perfect moment, and Catherine memorized every detail of it. We have a good life, Jake said finally. The best life, Catherine agreed, and it all started with a blizzard, a desperate walk through the snow, and a cowboy who knew exactly what needed to be done to keep us both alive. Jake grinned. And a city woman who was brave enough to trust him. They kissed as the sun set over their ranch, two people who had survived the worst together and built something beautiful from that shared experience. Their love had been forged in desperate circumstances, tempered by hard work and challenge, and strengthened by every year they spent together. It was a love that would endure for the rest of their lives, a testament to the power of trust, determination, and the simple decision to fight for survival together rather than give up alone. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear overhead, Catherine rested her head on Jake's shoulder and thought about that terrified young woman struggling through the snow 14 years ago. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything would be all right, that the handsome stranger pulling her through the storm would become her husband, her partner, her great love. She wished she could tell her younger self that the worst night of her life would lead to the best years she could imagine. But perhaps that younger Catherine had already known deep down. Perhaps that was why she had looked into Jake's eyes and made the choice to trust him, to strip away not just her wet clothes but all her fears and reservations, to survive together rather than die alone. It had been the right choice then, and it remained the right choice now. Catherine Hartley had found her home, her purpose, and her happiness in the arms of a cowboy who had saved her life. And together they had built a legacy that would endure for generations, a family and a ranch that stood as proof that even the darkest, coldest night could lead to a bright and beautiful dawn.